Combined District Plan, hearing stream 8, day 1 of 1 on Monday the 24th of February. Before we start with our introductions of the panel and officers, I'd like everyone to be upstanding and do a karakia. Ai te paemonga, raro ki te tai. Ai te awa tonga, raro ki te awa raki. Tēnei taha hori o awhai tātai. Whānau whānau, haere mai te taupu, honi e riri tai. Welcome everyone in the room and anyone watching online. Ko Robin Cherry Campbell toko ingoa. I will be chairing today's hearing stream and from Carlton District Council. Invite the panel to introduce themselves. Right.
Yes, good morning everybody. David McMahon, Independent Commissioner and Planning Practitioner based in Wellington.
Kia ora everybody, Brian Della, Carlton District Council Hearings Commissioner.
Kia koutou katoa, or Kiriana Sims talking about Hearing Commissioner and Ngāti Kapanunu ki Wairarapa representation.
Good morning, Alistair Plummer from the South Wairarapa District Council.
Morning, Craig Bias, Marsden District Council.
Good morning, Hamish Wesley, Reporting Officer, Financial Contributions.
Katie Treadaway, Reporting Officer for the Transport topic.
Hi, Alice Falona, Planner at Marsden District Council. Kia ora, Sarah Robertson, Planning and Regulatory Manager, Carlton.
Reese McHugh, Hearings Administrator.
And I believe, are you online? Would you like to introduce yourself too?
Good morning, I'm Morgan Fallowfield and I'm the Reporting Officer for the Subdivision chapter.
And welcome, thank you.
Thank you.
And also I think we have Thomas Travila.
Yes, good morning. I'm just tuning in for the opening statements. I'm appearing later this afternoon.
Thank you very much. Welcome.
Thank you.
Good to have you here. So today's hearing stream is District-Wide Matters Part 2, and we'll be covering the Transport, Subdivision and Financial Contributions chapter. And if we're ready, I will hand over Katie for the Transport report.
So I'll take the first two paragraphs of the summary statement as read, if that's okay. Yeah. Start with the operative district plan. So paragraph number 3. The operative district plan seeks to maintain the safe and efficient operation of the transport infrastructure in the Wairarapa, being the road network, railway and airport facilities such as Hood Aerodrome, to manage the adverse effects of subdivision use infrastructure. So the objectives are achieved through policy direction, a primarily regulatory approach with district-wide permitted activity rules for access, parking and loading in Rule 21.125, reference standards in Appendix 5. The rules themselves also include minimum loading, parking and access requirements for a range of activities. Non-compliances with the requirements in Rule 21.125 requires resource consent as a restricted discretionary activity. In addition, there are permitted activity standards for roading, access, parking and loading areas in each of the zone chapters, and non-compliance is a restricted discretionary activity. So all roads are deemed to be designated for roading purposes. However, there have not been any process to ensure that newly created roads via subdivision and land development have a designation applied. Roads are zoned with the same zoning as the adjacent land. Provisions relating to Hood Aerodrome seek to mainly manage noise and reverse sensitivity effects of surrounding properties. And the operative district plan identifies an airport protection area and obstacle limitation services specifications in Appendix 11. So the district plan review. The review of the operative district plan has confirmed that the significant resource management issues relating to transport are essentially the same as identified in the operative district plan. the significance of issues is also largely unchanged. Transport is a key component of the urban environments and contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. A national and regional direction supports for low carbon and multimodal transport system, which should also be reflected in the key issues of the Wairarapa. So the proposed district plan contains a transport chapter which sets out objectives, policies and rules. Three objectives in this chapter address transport network, adverse effects from the construction, operation, maintenance and development of the transport network, and effects of activities on the transport network. The chapter includes 11 policies addressing the transport network, including supporting a multimodal system for design outcomes, the role of the transport corridor, on-site facilities, transport network connections, high generating traffic activities, railway crossings, Hood Aerodrome, and the Wairarapa 5-town trail network. It includes rules and a set of standards that address technical requirements for design information of on-site transport facilities and public facilities. So the key changes proposed for transport are reference to council development engineering standards, incorporation of standards into the transport chapter with a balance between reference to external standards to minimise detail in the chapter and the inclusion of technical standards content in the chapter for clarity and certainty. A rule threshold requiring resource consent for high generating traffic activities over specified thresholds. Rules requiring resource consents for new vehicle intersections onto state highways. Cycle parking standards and requirement for end of trip facilities. Classification of roads according to the One Network framework. Minimum parking space requirements have been retained for Carterton and South Wairarapa and are not included for Masterton as per the National Policy Statement for Urban Development. Accessible parking requirements are included in all districts. Stop there. Information.
Do we have any matters from the panel that require clarifying or any questions up to this point?
Yes, through you, Robin, I've got a couple straight away. I'll just run through them in chronological order. Paragraph 5, all roads are deemed to be designated for roading purposes. That's presumably both state highways and local roads. Yes, that's in the operative plan. Is that also the assumption with the proposed plan?
The roads have, I need to double check that actually, how that works. But yes.
State highways have been designated.
Yes.
Over, but not the local roads.
Not the local roads, okay. So the roads will take on the zoning. Is it a centre-line approach for? Yes, okay.
Where do paper roads fit into that then?
They would have the zoning, they would still have the same zoning.
The land zoning would apply to paper roads.
Aren't they designated anyway?
So what you just said is only state highways are designated for roading.
We've had some issues in South Wairarapa where we've had to get rid of paper roads, and it has been quite a complicated process.
Yep. So there might be a difference there between the zoning and designations under the district plan and the ownership and status of the roads as paper roads. So stopping, for example, road stopping under the Local Government Act. Yes, that's.
There are no designations on those.
Correct. Not correct. The proposed plan.
Sorry, just carrying on.
Sorry.
I'm just interested in Hood Aerodrome. Has there been a change in approach between the operative plan and the proposed plan in the way which Hood Aerodrome? So is Hood Aerodrome designated? Does it have a designation? I know this will come up in a subsequent hearing.
Double check, but from my understanding.
Yes. And is that just a land designation, or does it involve air noise and height designations?
I know the noise provisions have been rolled over. I'm not sure about the designation.
So the designation, I'll double check, but the designation's just for the aerodrome itself.
Yes, just
Provide for the use and function of the aerodrome facility. Then in terms of noise, that there's a noise contour with noise rules for installation, but not designated. So it's a rule.
yes.
And then the same for the obstacle limitation service in terms of takeoff approach fans. They're rules rather than designations.
Okay, thank you. So that's okay. So that's largely a rollover from the operative to the proposed. Okay, thank you.
The one change has been just the dimensions of, I think, two of the obstacle limitation services, just to reflect the current aircraft.
Where will when and where will they be dealt with?
The noise
Sure.
hearing, which is hearing stream 10.
Yes, and the surface limitation.
This hearing in terms of transport, and from memory, there's no submission.
Yes.
This instance.
Yeah.
My final question is just about the high traffic generation rule. This is a new rule, so there was no equivalent in the operative district plan. Okay. Can you explain for myself and the panel how it works in terms of the threshold, what activities it applies to, what zones, and what the information requirements are?
Is rule 5.
R5?
And so it basically sets out that any activity that generates, I guess, a volume that exceeds the standards in standard 29, so then go to 29. It's a table.
Hang on. I'll just. Yes, got that. Standard 29. Yeah.
It sets out the first table there, table 16, sets out, I guess, the thresholds for certain zones. And then the table below sets out activities and the thresholds for those. If you were to exceed those thresholds, then that rule would apply. And then it also requires, it sets out when an ITA is also likely to be required, and it's in Appendix 1, which requires, I guess, sets out the requirements for the ITA.
Come back to the ITA in a moment. Just focusing on standard 29 and tables 16 and 17.
Mm-hmm.
What's the can you just take us through the column headings on both of those and what they mean?
So it's table 16.
Yes.
So the first one is the average daily threshold. And there's a definition.
So if I've got an activity in the first row, which is the gen res, settlement zones and open space,
Mm-hmm.
say it's a, I don't know, multi-unit development
Mm-hmm.
of, I don't know, 5 units. How would a developer know whether they comply with the average daily traffic or the peak alley or the heavy vehicle movement threshold? And is that based on operation or construction or both?
Where it is.
41.
Yeah.
Yeah, 41.
So can you say that?
So let's say there's a multi-unit development in the residential zone. How does a developer know whether they comply or don't comply with the 3 rows? And is is it compliance for construction traffic or is it operational traffic, i.e. post-construction?
I need to relook at that table and come back to you.
Okay. And that's the first question. And the second question is, what's the relationship between tables 16 and 17? 17 seems more detailed. It's actually specifies the actual activities, whereas table 16 is just focuses on the zones and presumably all activities.
The table below sets out, I guess, the expected traffic generation for a certain activity. So if you read the statement above, it provides guidance on
Okay.
those activities.
Okay, so
And it helps you determine whether the ITA is likely to be required.
okay, so taking, say, the 200 vehicles per day in the general res zone, that would be equivalent to 25 residential units.
Yeah.
80 units for retirement living, 50 for a preschool. Okay.
That kind of answered that first question. Operational.
And 400 vehicles a day is, okay, I see. Yeah, that's useful. And just to complete table 18, which is the type of ITA required. Can you tell us and this might deal with one of the appendices, I think, index APP1. Just to tell us what's the difference between a basic and a full ITA.
The appendix 1 sets out, I guess, the requirements
Okay.
for an ITA and these different things of what might be required. The only real difference between the basic and the full ITA is it's 12 in the table.
Okay.
The assessment of the strategic assessment, so assessment of other strategies and documents.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for that.
Yeah, Kate, could you explain to me how you see this ITA working in, the way I read it, to me, it makes sense in a city where there is public transport and where there's lots of options. Please explain to me how you see this working in Featherston.
As in, if it's needed, bring it.
Well, there's one bus an hour in Featherston, one bus.
I guess
So my logic here is saying, what is the point in doing this when there is no option and there is no capacity to increase public transport than what is already provided? So what benefit is anyone going to get out of this cost in a small town?
Out of an ITA, you mean?
Yeah. What's the point?
back to the.
So I'm reading the Greater Wellington Regional Council thing and I'm going to ask that question then, but.
It's not just on the public transport side of it. There's a number of other requirements that you set out in the ITA.
Explain to me something that's going to benefit Featherston by doing this.
You're still looking at like the expected travel demands when you're assessing a proposal, and the transport will be the main one. But I guess it's the level of, if you're taking Featherston, for example, your ITA will respond to the level of detail and significance of the proposal. So it could just be what you're saying, a statement on, in terms of the travel choice assessment that.
Okay, so this plan has to provide some form of, it's making rules that benefit the way our community develops. This to me, in a in a small, this is written for something like a city where you're trying to integrate traffic and so on and so forth. There is no integrated traffic in the Wairarapa. There is one bus an hour that goes from Masterton to Martinborough. And I've watched that bus for 6 years, and generally during the day, there might be 4 people on it, if you're lucky. It is busy, granted, first thing in the morning, because it picks up school kids to go to Masterton, and in the evening it brings school kids back. But other than that, you could probably run the same transport system with a minibus. So this rule adds nothing to the benefit of the community except cost. So I'm really struggling to say, what is the point in it? To put this into a plan, that means if you wanted to do a retirement village in Greytown or Featherston or Martinborough or Carterton, to have to go to this cost is the benefit, and what's the purpose? I know, but it is a topic of conversation. It has been submitted on.
I guess the rule, one aspect of the transport, the ITA is doing that assessment of looking at other means of getting places in the public transport side of it. But the other is providing assessment of transport effects, and for those high generating traffic activities, that is something that you will need to assess. So having a transport assessment helps you consider those traffic and transport related effects. I would have to talk to, I guess, some of the council planners, but
From what I'm seeing here,
that is,
Greater Wellington submitted on this. You've accepted them.
Mhm.
And I'm asking you, why have you accepted them? Where's the benefit and what's the rationale for accepting it? I'm not hearing that, how it fits to the.
Why don't we park that until we actually start discussing the submissions at this point? We're not at that point yet.
What might be useful, Katie, is if you could take us to the policy basis for the high traffic generating C7, page 4. This policy also, that's, yes.
so there is, I guess, a bit of discussion on this later, but do you want to just talk through the policy?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm getting from that there's a real focus on safety and efficiency of the network from this policy. Presumably, we'll get onto this later. There are standards in the transport network that relate to things like access, width and location, separation, distances from intersections, parking, loading, those sort of things. Parking not in Masterton, obviously, but I guess a high level question, picking up on Commissioner Plimmer's is, what's the need for the high traffic generating activity rule if there's compliance with those traffic standards relating to access and parking and loading and manoeuvring, sealing of the accessway, all of those sort of things? Is the high traffic generating activity rule needed over and above those standards?
Yes, I see it as a way to assess those activities and how the transport network can cope with them. And also, I guess, if there is any other, they can comply with all those standards, but if there's any other adverse effects, yeah.
Are you suggesting then that to take a more recent example than Greytown Orchards, which has 50 something, it's more than that, didn't do a transport impact statement as part of their resource consent?
I don't know specifically if they.
Because I would suggest to you that when my own subdivision of my own property, I had to justify how many vehicles could come up my drive. So I'm not sure why adding a rule that already is being done, it's just another cost. It's not providing anything extra that's already being done as part of any resource consent. And you've just added in and subdivision, and that's on the basis of Greater Wellington's submission. But I'm not seeing any justification for that when it's already being done.
I think it is often already being done with these resource consent applications. So I guess the district plan kind of formalises it, and it shows that an applicant, perhaps a layperson that is doing a subdivision, that this is likely to be a requirement. So they're not questioned, do I then need to do it? Because I would imagine most councils are requiring some form of that corresponds to the scale of their
I
development.
think your key words there that I'm hearing are it's formalising
Yeah.
what's already happening and making it clear for plan users to be aware of, whereas possibly to the operative district plan, they may be caught unawares because it's not obvious to them.
What might be useful in your right of reply is to have a working case example. And I'm thinking of and I may have my facts wrong here. There was a supermarket development or a proposal to bring access to a supermarket. Was it Greytown? Yeah, a couple of years ago or a year ago.
Yeah, still ongoing.
Yeah. Presumably it triggered consents because of wide access off a state highway. I think there was a heritage issue involved also, but putting that to one side, if you could factually just indicate what rules it triggered, what it would have triggered, other than the traffic generating, because presumably it was this rule wasn't enforced, didn't have legal effect at the time that that application was heard. So that would be useful. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
So for both triggered under the proposed
And the
operative.
Yes. And what the difference in activity statuses would be. As a general rule, get onto this later, non-compliance with standards like parking, access and that, what's the default activity status?
Generally, it's restricted.
Yes.
Yes.
And under the high traffic generation rule, it could differ, couldn't, depending on, was it always RDA?
Both RDA.
Okay. And I think what confused me a little bit there was a table 18, which referred to different activities and type of RTA. Okay.
There we go.
Yep. Thank you, Robin.
Anything else?
Good.
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 Yeah, just a couple of questions on Hood Aerodrome. Look at page 52.
What A, is it, Craig?
Oh, no.
No.
I'm not.
Oh,
The chapter. Yeah.
The transport.
The transport chapter, page 52,
52.
existing runways.
You've got one existing grass runway, Northern Vector. That has been deleted for the last 2 years. And so as noted in the AIP on the next page, restricted to locally, that was removed over 2 years ago due to an unfortunate accident that happened on the field. And just over this, you've also got 2 future runways that are 1331 and I think it's 1331 and 1432. That's one magnetic degree of separation. Just seems a little bit, the fans and all that kind of stuff, but all the noise and the height restrictions would all be very similar. Just wondering if it's a little bit of overkill, that's all.
Go back to that, the manager of Hood Aerodrome and just check those details, but this is what required us in terms of the status.
That northern grass vector was removed for a safety concern. So.
Just while we're on Hood Aerodrome, just to look back to the question around designations, I've checked there's 3 designations for Hood Aerodrome.
the operative.
And the operative, there's one designation in the operative plan, but it applied in 3 parts because there were 2 notice requirements to amend it over the last 10, 15 years. And so in the proposed plan, that's been separated into 3 separate individual designations, one for the main aerodrome itself and the aircraft facilities, and then 2 separate designations for what's referred to as the air park. So that's the hangars and other ancillary activities that occur on the aerodrome.
But the runways would be in the main aerodrome. Yes.
And my understanding, the reason for being split is different conditions that apply to the aerodrome designation, and there's separate conditions that apply to the air park, mostly around construction effects.
Yes, and presumably those designations have just simply been rolled over into the proposed plan. And
With one modification to each of them, which is the correct street address for the aerodrome.
so and they'll be heard in May.
So just to clarify in relation to page 54, as part of the right of reply, you'll go back and check with Port Aerodrome and update the runways accordingly.
We will, but we'll just probably need to check scope.
Okay.
Can you have some consideration of clause 16 when you do that, whether it's relevant or not?
Doesn't seem right having something in a district plan that is
No longer
affected.
no longer use. Yes.
Paragraph 12. Design original submissions, 184 submission points and 10 further submissions. 23 further submission points were received on the transport topic. Submissions were generally supportive of the provisions where amendments were sought. They related to providing further clarification. So I've read the respective evidence. Greater Wellington Regional Council, Ms. Jones, Adamson Shaw, Ms. O'Halligan, the phone companies, Tom Anderson and the joint statement, the fuel companies, Mr. Travella, Ms. Cayley, Fulton Hogan and New Zealand Transport Agency, Mr. Talbot. I note that Mr. Talbot, on behalf of the New Zealand Transport Agency, agrees with the recommendations in section 4 report. And so I respond with evidence.
Yeah, Katie, can I just ask a question on the Regional Council submission here, where it says best provided for? Does that place an onus on the Regional Council to provide as well, given that they are responsible for transport?
Hasn't got it up to that yet.
No, you're talking about Kirshu. You're talking about 1.1, aren't you?
She's only just finished reading these out, so you're.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Oh,
Sorry.
fire.
Okay. Well, that's my question. It's coming up. So, sorry.
That's
My
right.
apologies. I thought you were just read 1.1.
Policy 1, paragraph 15. So Mr. O'Brien considers that the policy should be amended to align with RPS change 1 and references greenhouse gas emissions, and that a new clause is included that development occurs in locations with safe and efficient use of transport infrastructure, including active and sustainable transport modes, is best provided for. I consider that to give effect to the RPS, I agree that reference to greenhouse gas emissions is included in the policy. In terms of location and development, I consider that this is addressed within the strategic direction objectives, objective 2, and implemented through the zone chapters where required, such as the location and spatial extent zones, including the future open zone.
Okay. So does that policy then put an implied requirement on the Regional Council, who is responsible for public transport, to then provide? If we're making provision in the plan for it, is there not an implied indication then that the people who are asking for that plan change then actually provide public transport?
That could be a question you
Yeah.
ask the submitter.
Love the silence.
Right.
Yes, maybe you could ask that, sorry, Brian, this afternoon.
They're really interesting to get your interpretation of it, because they are asking for these.
Yeah.
We're saying yes, but there's a quid pro sort of thing here. So you're asking us to change our plan. Are you then going to?
Only the greenhouse gas emissions, that was straight away.
Yeah.
But it's right throughout this. That's right throughout this transport thing about the whole lot of this is about providing for public transport.
We're wanting a plan that can provide for it, and we're putting those provisions into the plan. You'll have to ask, I guess, the regional council how that is going there, but you still want a plan that can enable and provide for public transport.
And what happens today could be very different from
Yeah,
what's happening in 5-10 years' time as well, I guess. So that's
my
why.
life for 50 years, so I'm not holding my breath.
Well, don't hold your breath, but you never know. Things are starting to shift and move and change. So it's good to have a provision.
Anyway, just one from me. Can you just the change to P1 came through the 42A to clause B.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just remind me what submission that was in response to?
I think it was either, I need to go look now. I think it was either the regional council or NZTA. But
Sorry, I'm just being lazy. I've got P2 in front of me.
I'll have a quick.
yeah. It was NZTA.
Was NCTA, okay. And that they're not presenting today the older statement, I think.
Yeah, they're happy with.
Just my question to you is, you look at the chapeau to the policy, the beginning of the policy, which is a supporting,
Yeah.
that promotes, and then we've got the word requiring, and I just wonder whether the two operative words fit together. Okay, one's it's almost like an encouragement
Yeah.
at the beginning, and then a requirement. Is it where multimedia options are provided then require?
Yeah.
Could you have a wee think about that in your right of reply, and if you need to, a discussion with NZTA, just out of fairness? Just looking for some alignment in the policy.
Yeah, no, I see that too.
Yeah.
So policy P3, role of transport corridors. Mr. Anderson considers that P3 should be amended to reflect that part of the transport corridor is to provide space for infrastructure. As stated in the Section 42A report, this policy is focused on the role of the transport corridors from a transportation perspective. While transport corridors may serve other purposes, I consider that the additional text requested would detract and confuse the purpose of this policy and would not contribute towards achieving the transport objectives. Other infrastructure, both within and outside of the transport corridors, is covered in the Network Utilities chapter. Therefore, do not recommend any changes to TRP3. Policy 4, on-site facilities. Mr. O'Brien has provided amended wording to TRP4 to align the policy with the RPS change 1 to promote a shift towards more active modes of transport. I agree with the reasoning and recommended that TRP4 is amended. And so P7, high traffic activities, and also Standard 29 and Appendix 1. Mr. O'Brien considers that TRP7 and Standard 29 and Appendix 1 should be amended to include subdivision activities, as they consider that if subdivision for more than 25 lots in the residential zone occurs, then these lots are sold separately to individual applicants that apply for separate resource consents. an indicated transport assessment may not be required despite the activity generating high traffic. I agree with the reasoning provided by Mr. O'Brien that larger scale subdivision proposals should be included in PR P7 and Standard 29 and Appendix 1, and recommended that they are amended.
I've got something on that. Alistair, if you want to.
Yeah, I just, if you apply for a subdivision and then get a consent, you're applying for X number of blocks and so on and so forth, and then you get title for those blocks and so on. So I'm not quite sure of this argument to say, oh, then if they're sold separately, they're always sold separately. So the argument here doesn't seem to make sense to me, that the issue is at the consenting time for the subdivision, not whether the blocks are sold separately individually.
I guess you could apply for a subdivision consent without your land use consent. So you could apply for the subdivision and subdivide all the lots, and then they're sold. And then you may or may not need a land use consent to build a dwelling on the lot. And that would mean that at that time, there was, they're each being sold separately. There's never been a consideration of the traffic effects of those, say, 25 lots.
So what the submitter's saying is that in that situation, the high traffic generating rule would not be triggered at the land use stage, and therefore submitter wants it to be considered at the subdivision stage.
We've got an example where that actually occurred, where we get a 25 lot subdivision and that we haven't talked about access to it. I can't think of.
I guess it's again coming back to that. It's probably already being done, but it's formalising it. From talking to council planners, most of the time they are already receiving an ITA with their subdivision application, but it's ensuring that applicants are aware.
Can we just test that? Let's say a 25 lots. Presumably this is all zones.
Yes.
Let's have a look at the rural zone first. Well, it'd be unusual in a rural zone, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's look at a residential zone. So what we'll go to R1, do we?
5.
5, sorry. Oh, yeah, okay. But without the change, rule 5.
Yeah.
A residential subdivision with 25 allotments, is it a controlled or restricted discretionary? A controlled entry, presumably. Depending on compliance with table. Oh, sorry, we'll go to subdivision, that subdivision rule, sorry.
So I guess the subdivision rules in terms of transport, they require compliance with the transport.
Yes.
Yeah, with the transport sector.
Yeah.
But you're already, if you're doing, I guess, a subdivision, you're already, residential.
Yeah.
Requiring
Access.
and access.
Yeah.
I would thought you can't do any subdivision without access.
Well, I mean, this will be a question for Ms. Fallowfield, presumably, but in the subdivision chair, I know we're jumping around a little bit here, but controlled activities, the entry, compliance with number of standards, presumably including the minimum allotment size. Matters of control, it does comply. Set out in okay, it refers back to policies, size, design, layout, legal.
Sub 7 refers to all new allotments created must have legal and physical access to a road in accordance with the relevant standards and TR.
Yes. I guess what I and Commissioner Plummer are getting at is whether this is an efficient approach to subdivision, requiring subdivision to also be subject to the high traffic generating chapter. So there might be a need for you and Ms. Falloway to have a Fallowfield, sorry, to have a discussion about that. But just on some factual matters, there's the submission from Greater Wellington asking for this addition to both the policy and to the rule. Did it attract any further submissions?
I would need to check that one.
Yes, could you do that? And could you also advise us how the relief was summarised in the summary of submissions?
Mr. Cayley, Fulton Hogan considers that reference to amenity values should be deleted from P7, as stated in the WTO report. Serve multiple purposes, including the movement of people, goods and services, as well as reflecting adjoining land uses. The amenity values and character of the road contributes to the amenity values and character of the local environment. High generating traffic activities can adversely affect amenity values and character, therefore is a relevant consideration for this type of activity. I therefore do not recommend any changes to PRP7.
Yeah, I have a question there. Go to the chapeau of P7. There seems to be a focus on and I think I asked you earlier about the safety and efficiency of the roading network. And whilst I note that clause B was part of the notification, I wonder whether you think clause B fits neatly into what the front end of that policy is trying to achieve, which seems to be more about the compliance with standards and avoiding effects on the well, it deals with things like traffic demand and safety and efficiency issues, as opposed to amenity in the Section 7 sense of the word. If I look at what an APP has to provide on pages 45 and 46, tend to be technical matters such as site layout, access, servicing, where it works, as opposed to amenity in the character sense. I just wonder whether clause B is actually given effect to in the rule or the standard. Could you have a think about that? It talks about how the adverse effects on the road transport network will be avoided, remedied, or mitigated. Struggling a little bit to understand how amenity values fits into.
Mr. Trevila, the fuel companies considers that there can be instances changes to service stations result in no inconsequential changes to traffic movements. Examples include replacing existing underfuel storage tanks, changing fuel dispenser layout, changing internal site circulation, or installing electric vehicle charging stations. The current rules apply to both new and existing activities, so any changes would trigger a resource consent. Mr. Trevila has provided an amended rule which includes a permitted activity standard that the changes will not result in more than a 5% increase in traffic generation. I consider that this rule framework could potentially result in cumulative effects as they as it would apply to every activity, I invite the submitter at the hearing to provide additional evidence on the risk of cumulative effects for this 5% increase.
If the submission looks at, to me, there's a difference in that he hasn't been very clear and concise. I would have thought there's a difference between a temporary activity, such as the removal of storage tanks or replacement of storage tanks, which is a temporary activity. It's a roadworks issue, compared to adding in charges or adding in fuel bowsers or those, which are more permanent. Is there some middle room here that you could consider that would say, okay, for temporary activities, you don't need to go to this effect, but for permanent ones, you do. So it's actually allowing people to get on with their business and to upgrade their facilities or whatever, because we know fuel tanks don't last forever, and we know you have to replace these things from time to time, but that doesn't necessarily change that might be a temporary increase in road traffic, but it is literally for the purpose of while they're doing that. And this seems to be have no flexibility in it.
And we'll have, on that, Mr. Trevilla's listening in, and we'll have him later today. It goes back to my wider question about whether these vehicle numbers are operational or construction based or both. So it doesn't, the current notified provision don't seem to I may be wrong.
And there are other things that are, he raises the issue of perhaps electric charging. Is that an increase in traffic, or is that replacing a petrol vehicle with an electric vehicle? Therefore, there is no net increase in vehicles. So you've got these other issues that need to be thought out a little bit more holistically rather than a blunt rule.
But onto the 6 vehicle crossing design. To Ms O'Halligan, as stated in the Section 42 report, ED diagrams in the engineering development standard. I have recommended that figure TR3 is replaced with figure R04 of the engineering design standard. Note that this change has not been reflected in Appendix 2 of the Section 42 report, as the figure needs to be redrawn to match the style of the.
But you've shown that change in blue, haven't you?
Yeah.
Yes. And presumably there was scope for that change.
So on standard 8, vehicle crossing formation, Ms O'Halligan considers that the ceiling of a vehicle access way for a distance of 30 metres from the edge of a road carriageway is explained out in the Section 42 report. The vehicle crossing standards in TR8 are based on the requirements of Council's Development Engineering Standard. It is understood that these requirements are based on the New Zealand Transport Agency's accessway standards and guidelines. I understand the 30-metre distance for the formation of the edge of the road from the edge of the road of the carriageway is based on experience to avoid or minimise debris tracking onto the road. I therefore do not recommend any changes to TRS7. TRS10, Rural Accessway Design. Ms O'Halligan considers amendments are required to TRS10 as stated in the Section 42 report. Requirements are based on New Zealand Transport Agency's accessways guidelines. I understand the 9-metre radius plus 6-metre widening is based on the standard and guidelines. Therefore, I do not recommend any changes to TRS10. TRS12. Ms O'Halligan considers that TRS1 be amended to reference the New Zealand standards, figure 3.4 as per Section 3C 14.3 of the Development Engineering Standard. And I agree that the standard should be consistent with the Development Engineering Standard and recommended that submission is accepted with amended wording. TRS 13, Ms O'Halligan considers amendments are required to clarify the extent of deck ceiling. I note the submitter did not provide an original submission or further submission in relation to these points, and therefore these are out of scope. And that is the same with TRS 14 on firefighting access. So paragraph 31, TRS 16, minimum parking bays. Mr. O'Brien considers that the minimum car parking requirements are deleted, and this is consistent with high-level direction in the NPSUD to provide for housing choice, housing affordability, and transport choices. As stated in the Section 42A report, Masterton District Council meets the definition of a Tier 3 urban environment, and Masterton District Council is the only council subject to the minimum car parking requirements under the NPSUD. The primary modes of transport in Carterton and South Wairarapa districts is the private motor vehicle, and as they are service towns for rural areas, car parking minimums are required to manage traffic effects. I therefore do not recommend any changes to TRS 16.
I think that goes back to the fact that regional council doesn't actually know the towns.
Motor car is the main means of transport in the South Wairarapa. I thought it was public transport.
Perhaps he's not familiar with our small service towns.
Can I just seek a clarification? When in your first sentence on 31, you say Mr. Bryan considers is that, does he consider that the minimum car parking requirement should be deleted from
all
yeah, okay. Okay. Thank you.
So standard 24, cycle parking design. Mr. O'Brien considers that the standard be amended to reference best practice standards for cycle parking design and layout. As stated in the Section 42A report, I consider that requiring consideration of best practice as part of the standard could be subjective and may be unclear if facilities comply with the standard. Therefore, I do not recommend any changes to TRF. And paragraph 33, Mr. Cayley, Fulton Hogan, considers that quarrying activities should be exempt from minimum car parking and loading facility standards due to the significant difference between quarrying and other activities. As set out in the Section 42 report, I do not consider that there should be an exception for quarrying activities, and I would anticipate that most quarries would easily be able to comply with the requirements.
Yes. Do you think you could provide a little bit further information on that last statement? About identifying what standards would be relevant to, which car parking standards would be relevant to a quarry activity? Just remind us when you do of the status of quarrying in the zone, dealing with the rural zone, presumably. What are you aware of the number of, my fellow commissioners will be aware of this, but what the number of quarries that exist in the 3 districts?
There would be a number.
Yeah,
Well, quarries.
Yeah.
we're a few, but yeah.
Heaps.
Okay.
Yeah, because you're talking limestone, gravel.
And you've got private quarries on farms and all sorts of things.
Yes.
Lots.
It's just that we're not hearing from Fulton Hogan. They've lodged a statement. Okay. Forget that question. About the number of quarries, that is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But retain
Yeah.
what standards of
Yeah.
car parking are
Yeah.
relevant. Yeah.
Paragraph 36. The recommended amendments in response to the pre-circulated evidence on transport chapter are TRP1, amend to include reference to greenhouse gas emissions. Policy 4, amend to include facilitate multimodal transport to align with RPS change 1 and promote a shift towards active modes of transport. TRP7 and S29 and Appendix 1, amend to include subdivision. Replace figure TR3 with figure R04 from the Development Engineering Standard. And TRS 12 amends to reference the development engineering standards. And in addition, I note the following corrections to errors from section 42A report, including amendments to Appendix 1 to include a travel choice assessment, which were recommended in the section 42A report, changes not in Appendix 2.
Oh, okay. Who was the submitter there?
Greater Wellington.
With, just so I can mark up my version of,
The table,
Page 46.
yeah.
Was reference to my report, but wasn't in the changes onto the 40
okay.
report. Yeah,
but it's in the,
yeah.
it's in the copy attached to your summary statement. And there was scope for that, Greater Wellington.
They requested a change in the submission. I accepted it, but I didn't include it in the amended version.
Right.
Could I ask a question on APP1 though? I've looking through it. Apart from the strategic framework, the difference between a basic and a full ITA.
It is. We covered that earlier.
Sorry, I missed that. That's it. That's
I'd add in a practical sense as well that using the terms basic and full also implies a level of detail. So in terms, and the traffic engineer will be able to speak more to this than I can, but in terms of the nature of the assessment you're doing for a smaller scale high trip generation activity, which requires a basic assessment, would be a lot less than something that would require. So that's just those key words, I think, just imply meaning as well, rather than having more detail about what basic and full means.
you're more hopeful than I am.
I think that could be made more explicit in the,
Yeah.
yes,
A statement saying.
yeah.
Yeah.
Paragraph 38, the key matters in contention. TRP1, whether TRP1 is amended to developments occurring in locations where safe and efficient use of transport infrastructure, including for active and sustainable transport modes. TRP3, whether TRP3 is amended to refer to the transport corridor role to provide space for infrastructure. TRP7, whether TRP7 is amended to complete reference to character and values. TR5, whether TR5 is amended to include the permitted activity standards that changes will not result in more than a 5% increase in traffic generation. TRS8, whether the standard for sealing of a vehicle acts for a distance of 30 meters from the edge of the road carriageway should be reduced. TRS10, whether the rural access way design should be amended to reduce turning dimensions. TRS16, whether the minimum number of car parking bays should be deleted. TRS24, whether the standard should be amended to reference best practice standards for cycle parking layout, and whether quarrying activities should be exempt from the on-site parking and loading facility standards.
Question. TRS8, will we be able to delve into that a little bit? I'm just concerned around the being applicable in rural zones. This is 30 metres is quite a long way. Quite a long. Now, I understand the rationale when you talked about debris going onto the road. However, anyone who's tried to lay 30 metres of concrete or stuff, that this is a huge expense for these people. A problem that possibly isn't relevant. You tend to get a lot of debris on the road when Yes, so a farmer comes out of the paddock, does that have to be sealed coming out of the paddock?
Yeah, the paddock one.
Coming out of any vehicle crossing to a sealed road. So if this farmer has a paddock that he's just ploughed, are we expecting there to be a formed and sealed driveway going out to it? Just a little nuanced.
Does that not actually, as per your paragraph 25, say that these requirements are based on the NZTA access way standards and guidelines? Which is why
That's what,
we
yeah.
have it in the PDP.
Yeah, it's a great piece of bureaucracy that doesn't work. That's the point
It's
I'm
also
making.
council engineering standards
Yeah,
and NZTA standards. So
If you drove from here to Greytown, you could probably think of about 150
okay,
gates.
but it's what we must remember is that the district plan is also guided by standards, and
Yes.
whilst practical terms, as we know, often things like this don't make sense. It is a standard. David, do you want to?
I'm going to keep out of this one. But
I mean,
I just got, TRSA exempts rural zones, Maori purpose zone and future urban zone.
because the rural zones are covered in that one.
Yes.
Yeah, but then put number two
So they're still.
and number three, cover them.
would it be appropriate, and do we have scope to reference engineering standards and NZTA standards? Would that be appropriate?
Or do we need to refer it to subdivisions? Because a paddock gate is not a subdivision.
I had a question on the relationship between subdivision and this rule and subdivision. When this rule be triggered at the time of subdivision, or would it be only triggered at the time of land use?
I'd say it will be triggered at the time of land use.
Yes.
Constructing. Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
Both, in my view, it'd be both under the zone chapters for any land use. One of the standards
These are both district-wide rules.
was the transport chapters requirements. So if you were establishing, let's say, a new commercial activity in the commercial zone, retail outlets, you'd need to comply your vehicle crossings.
Yes.
Need to comply with the transport standards to be permitted.
If you're doing a
Subdivision.
Yeah.
Same. There's one of the standards in the subdivision chapter is compliance with the transport chapter requirements. So any new access or vehicle crossing.
Yep.
For a subdivision would need to comply.
Take a farmer down number one line, for example. It's a rural road. And the farmer has paddocks on either side of the road and goes, instead of me going all the way back out to the back of my farm and coming around I'm just going to put a gate here and a gate on the other side of the road. Would this be triggered then with a 30-metre?
You'll love me for this in terms of the bureaucracy answer, so I'll acknowledge that. If it's a vehicle crossing, then yes. If it's a gate into a paddock, that's not a vehicle crossing.
I'm going to drive my vehicle.
What is the definition of a vehicle?
Yeah, a vehicle. So that would be a vehicle crossing. So it's an access to the property.
Okay, then we need to do something about this, because otherwise you're going to have farmers up in arms having to seal every single gate off a road for 30 metres. It's just ludicrous.
we might get a little bit of guidance from and Adams and Shaw when they come in.
Yeah.
For one moment. Robertson, would you like to add anything further?
In the last 10 years, in terms of a practical sense, it would be the rules would be very similar, and we have always exempted what we classify as farm access. Farm access for the purposes of the farming operation, we have not required it because it's not classified as a vehicle access that's going to be generating traffic that needs to look at its safety. It's a pragmatic approach. So in the last 10 years, we've never required a access from a farm fence.
Love it.
To be.
Can we use that same argument then for what we were talking about before, adding subdivisions to an ITA? practicalities, but we're putting ITA in to make sure there is no wriggle room, and yet on this one, we're having wriggle room.
I
So-
think
It's the same.
what
isn't
I'm
it?
hearing from Ms Robertson is that it's at the discretion of the councils and the planning officers as to the practicalities.
But no,
The
it's not.
district plan also gives scope to manage those who feel that they might be able to find loopholes and wriggle rooms to actually put in place and have it as safeguarding
But Greater
techniques.
Wellington Regional Council on their submission wanted to get rid of the wriggle room. And that's why we did added the word subdivision in, and yet Solitaire said,
So
oh, there is wriggle room with this one, so we
So
need to
we'll
be consistent. Yeah. Absolutely, and it is, like, I'm pleased to hear there is sensibility, but the plan doesn't allow for that.
Mr Wesney, have you got all of that?
Good question, really good.
But it ties back into, it's practical, but if all our planners leave and we get these rather overzealous people arriving, well, where's the 30 metres? It's just kind of,
And considering whether the rule's appropriate or not, that's the test.
Yeah. Yeah.
As usually, one of the things, and we'll perhaps discuss this with Mr Hagan later today, is whether the rule could differentiate between state highways and local roads or speed restrictions, as they're just alternatives that I think need to be considered in deciding on the appropriateness of the rule. Okay.
So ask a question about P3, please.
I don't know. It depends on the question.
So this is the one to providing space for infrastructure. ZTA has made it very clear in a lot of their latest, because they're trying to remove considered hazards within the road corridor. So whilst I can't find anywhere they submitted on it, they probably didn't see this, but is there guidance from NZTA and their rules about infrastructure in the road corridor? Have they updated their?
I think that's network utilities chapter.
I think
Yeah,
that
but
putting in the right reply on.
that's because we're putting it in, there's been a submission point on it.
And it's.
Subdivision.
Okay.
I know it's not being recommended, but we're getting an argument.
So
for it.
we can have that conversation when Mr Anderson submits on that particular point and on relevance of having infrastructure under that particular policy. Thank you very much. I think that finally concludes the transport chapter.
Very uncontentious.
And just a reminder to the panel that we've had an updated timetable put in front of us, and our first submitter will be speaking at 11:30. Just bearing that in mind. So as we've invited them to come in earlier, it would be really nice if we delayed them when they arrive. Moving on to the subdivision chapter. I think that's Miss Fallowfield. Welcome.
Good morning. So if I could start, please, by taking the introduction section, paragraphs 1 and 2 as read. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Thank you. So starting in section 2, the overview of subdivision chapter, paragraph 3. The operative Wairarapa Combined District Plan contains objectives, policies and rules relating to subdivision. All subdivision of land is at least a controlled activity status, provided they comply with the relevant performance standards for the zone, e.g. the minimum lot size, servicing, building coverage, transport and access, financial contributions, and compliance with any relevant development or structure plans. Non-compliance with performance standards makes the subdivision a restricted discretionary or non-complying activity. The review of the subdivision provisions in the operative district plan concluded that they were generally achieving the subdivision objectives of the operative district plan, particularly the mechanical aspects of the subdivision process. During the plan review, there were two key resource management issues identified. Issue 1, ad hoc and poorly managed subdivision can result in inappropriate and unanticipated outcomes for the relevant zones, areas, or precincts due to its scale, density, and type. This can adversely affect the identified characteristics and values of that zone, area, or precinct. Issue 2, subdivision that is unserviced or inappropriately serviced can result in environment and economic burden on the community. To address the two key issues identified during the plan review, the main changes to the subdivision provisions between the operative district plan and the proposed district plan are as follows. Aligning the subdivision provisions with national policy direction, consolidating and simplifying the subdivision rules and standards where relevant, strengthening the rural subdivision provisions to protect rural character, reducing the minimum lot size in residential zones to allow for slightly greater density, and aligning provisions with growth strategies and spatial plans.
Couple
Just a
from
couple?
me.
Yeah.
I'll keep this brief. Yellow field. Paragraph 5, just looking through the drivers A, B, C, and D and E for the review, aligning the subdivision provisions with national policy direction. Was there a particular national policy statement or statements that were giving that were causing that change in direction?
Yes, there was the National Planning Standards, the MPSUD, and I think there was a third from memory, which I can check from the Section 42A report.
Okay, presumably that might have been the highly productive land.
Oh,
one
yes.
in terms of rural subdivision.
Yes,
Okay.
that's right.
Okay. And item D, reducing the minimum lot size in residential zones was presumably to give effect generally to the MPSUD.
Yes.
Okay. And lastly, aligning provisions with growth strategies and spatial plans. For those growth strategies and spatial plans that are only currently being undertaken, might we see a potential change to subdivision rules through a future Schedule 1 process in the future? Is that a possibility?
I think that could be a possibility.
Thank you. That was all from me.
Thank you. If you'd like to continue.
So Section 3, matters raised in submissions. A total of 30 original submissions, 141 submission points, and 16 further submissions, 49 further submissions points were received on the subdivision chapter. Submitters were generally supportive of the subdivision chapter. Where changes were sought, they were sought to better enable subdivisions to provide for specific types of land use activities, strengthen relevant considerations for subdivisions, and clarify provisions. Moving on to Section 4, responses to pre-circulated expert evidence. I have read the respective evidence submitted in relation to the subdivision chapter, being that of Greater Wellington Regional Council, Mr. O'Brien, the telecommunication companies, Mr. Anderson.
And I think we can take those as read.
Okay.
I'll just go down to number 8. Thank you.
Sure. I note Mr. Talbot on behalf of NZ Transport Agency Waka Kotahi agrees with the recommendations in the Section 42A report. I note Ms. Egg's letter on behalf of Transpower agrees with the recommendations in the officer's report that are relevant to Transpower's submission. I note from Mr. Anderson's evidence on behalf of the telecommunication companies that 4 of the submission points were either accepted or the alternative relief recommended in the Section 42A report is acceptable. Therefore, changes to those provisions are no longer being pursued. Those provisions are limited to subdivision or sub-rule 1, 3, 4, and 5, and I acknowledge the joint statement of evidence as well. I note Mr. McGimpsey's evidence on behalf of Fire and Emergency New Zealand states recommendations to the fire and emergency submission points that are supported, being objective 2 and 3, policies 1 to 7, rules 1, 2, 4, 5, and 7. I respond to the remaining evidence below. Key issue 1, general matters and miscellaneous items. Mr. O'Brien sought amendments to the subdivision chapter to add definitions for water-sensitive urban design and hydraulic neutrality, as well as a new policy to manage the effects of subdivision on freshwater. In response to Mr. O'Brien, my position remained unchanged as an outcome of the conferencing on hearing stream 1, that is not to add definitions relating to water-sensitive urban design and hydraulic neutrality. New policy sub PX, managing the effects of subdivision on freshwater. Mr. O'Brien seeks a new policy be added to manage the effects of subdivision on freshwater as set out below. I will take that part as being read as well. So based on the response to minute 3 and minute 14 on integrated management of the adverse effects on freshwater from subdivision use and development, I recommend that new policy be added to the subdivision chapter. I anticipate that this policy will be implemented through the matters of control that refer to sections 108 and 220 of the RMA.
If we can just pause there, please.
Yes, good morning, Ms. Fallowfield.
Good morning.
Good morning. Two questions there. The wording of that new policy, was that stipulated in the submission notice of the submitter?
The wording as provided in paragraph 15 was as per the submission from Greater Wellington Regional Council.
Thank you. And can you just explain to the panel what you mean by this policy will be implemented through the matters of control that refer to sections 108 and 220? Because I'm struggling a little bit just to understand that myself.
Yes, I can. So sections 108 of the RMA relate to conditions on resource consents, and 220 relates to conditions on subdivision consents as a starting point.
Yes. These are matters of control or matters of discretion that are listed in the various rules.
Yes,
yeah,
that's correct.
And we see that quite a lot being repeated.
Yes.
So
for
yes, sorry, carry on.
For example, I was just going to point out the subdivision rules in majority of those. I'm just looking here at sub R7, the matters of control, for example, in 15 refer to those sections in the Act, and that is similar for other rules.
Yes. Does that suggest that managing the effects of subdivision on freshwater will always be able to be dealt with through a condition? Is that what you're saying?
I was anticipating that that policy could be implemented through the matters of control through the section 108 and 220 of the RMA, but there may be other considerations as well.
Yes. Presumably, did the submitter, Greater Wellington, did they ask for any change to the matters of control or the matters of discretion to give effect to that new policy?
I will need to double check that from.
Okay. What's the question? Yes, it's a question we'll put to Mr. O'Brien when he appears. But it just seems that there might be a bit of a gap there, given that section 108 or conditions under 108 and 220 might not always be able to implement the policy, which includes managing in a way to avoid, remedy or mitigate adverse effects. But I accept that when we're dealing with a controlled activity, there's no ability to decline the application. But with a restricted discretionary, there is an ability to decline an application, which may necessitate something other than a section 108 or 220 response. But if you could check that, or if you could listen to what Mr. O'Brien has to say when we ask him the same question, and there may be some additional work required for either of you then.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes.
So carrying on then. Key issue 2, subdivision objectives. Subdivision 02, servicing. Mr. Anderson considers that subdivision objective 2 be amended so that subdivision within the urban boundary connect to telecommunication networks and electricity networks alongside water, wastewater and stormwater networks, and that subdivision in rural zones are capable of connecting to a telecommunication network. A similar amendment is sought through sub P2. Linked to the amendments in sub O2 and sub P2 is an amendment sought to sub R2 to ensure that any connection made for new allotment to a telecommunication network be implemented in accordance with the network operator's requirements. In response to Mr. Anderson, I refer to the comments set out in paragraph 146 of the section 42A report and still do not consider any amendments are required.
Okay, thank you. Keep going.
Thank you. Subdivision 03, future development. Mr. O'Brien supports the change recommended to sub 03 to amend the objective title to read integrated future development and notes that this amendment is provided in paragraph 129 of the section 42A report, but the track change amendment in the sub appendix 2 reads integrated development. I acknowledge there is a difference in the amendment provided in paragraph 129 of the subdivision section 42A report and the track change amendment in appendix 2. I recommend that the sub 03 should read integrated future development. With respect to the request to include reference to public and active transport networks and services in sub 03, I consider that roads include public and active transport networks and services. I recommend amended wording to sub 03 as shown in appendix 1 and 2.
Thank you. Thank you. Yep.
Moving on to key issue 3, subdivision policies. Mr. O'Brien supports sub P1 but maintains the position that clause A is unclear and places too much emphasis on the reinforcement of existing character and qualities. In response to Mr. O'Brien's comments, I note that the word character and qualities has been used for consistency throughout the plan, including the zone chapters. I still do not consider any amendments are required. Ms. Kelly seeks that reverse sensitivities is expressly addressed in sub P1 and addresses reverse sensitivity through hearing streams 1 and 3. I consider the management of reverse sensitivity effects is most appropriately addressed in the zone chapters and do not consider an amendment is appropriate to sub P1. Therefore, I do not recommend any changes.
Thank you. Move on to the rules now.
Subdivision rules. Sub R2, subdivision on land to create additional lots, and sub R4, subdivision of land less than 4 hectares in the general rural zone and matters of control 15. Mrs. Ritchie has concerns with the proposed controlled activity status for rules sub 2 and sub 4. Specifically, Ms. Ritchie is concerned that a controlled activity status provides no option to decline a resource consent application, even if potential significant reverse sensitivity effects on established primary production activities are identified. To address this activity status for these rules, to address this, the activity status for these rules is sought to be changed to restricted discretionary. In response to Ms. Ritchie, the activity status for subdivision of land in the rural zone was addressed in Hearing Stream 3. In summary, I note that within the rural zone, there are setbacks required from existing intensive primary production activities. For example, residential units may not be located within 500 metres of an intensive primary production activity under separate ownership. If the standards cannot be complied with, a resource consent will be required. Matters of discretion include methods to avoid or mitigate reverse sensitivity effects. As previously noted in the Section 42A report, Matter 15 for sub R2 and sub R4 include management of potential reverse sensitivity effects on existing land use, such as noise, odour, dust, and visual effects. Therefore, I do not recommend any changes to sub R2, R4, or Matter of Control 15.
I want to just pause there for a moment, please.
Yes, so I've got a couple of questions on Ms. Ritchie's for the Pork Industry Board, and it also affects your recommendation on sub P1 too, just above under paragraph 28. This is a situation where you're saying the land use rules and land use controls provide the answer, particularly in terms of the setbacks that are established from intensive primary production. My first question is, presumably intensive primary production would include pig farms?
I think so. I would just need to double check the definition of that,
Yes.
but I think Mr. Wesney may have just
Mr.
agreed.
Wesney's been nodding, yes.
Yes, yeah.
On the basis that they do, okay. Presumably we've, there was a matter that was heard in Hearing Stream 3. Yes.
Yes.
Just remind us in your right of reply what submissions, if any, were on that setback.
Okay, I've made note of that.
Yes. But going back to the earlier question, this is, as I said, this is a situation where you're saying we can rely on the land use, which is a little bit at odds with what we heard earlier in relation to high traffic generation, where subdivision and land use is the recommended approach, both of them. So I just wonder whether you still, well, both you and Ms. Treadaway still think that that's the best way to go in terms of efficiency and effectiveness.
I think that would require discussion
Yes.
between myself and Ms. Treadaway, which
Yes.
we can
Yes.
do and respond in the right of reply.
Yes, it's probably more of a question for Ms. Treadaway, given that your approach is more in line with the philosophy that the submitter in relation to transport was raising.
Okay.
Right. So if I've got any other question, what's your response to Ms. Ritchie's concern that a controlled activity subdivision couldn't be declined for reasons of reverse sensitivity?
I agree that a controlled activity status means that consent must be granted. I understand that she does have concerns around reverse sensitivity effects, but I'm just looking at the chapter.
I add on to that, which it kind of relates as well. in sub R2, she's requesting, and specifically matter 15, and has these concerns because it's a controlled activity, but sub R2 applies to residential zones, commercial and mixed use, general industrial, multi-purpose, and then the 3 precincts. My understanding of those zones is there's not likely to be the primary production activities in these zones, maybe with the exception of the multi-purpose zone. Would that be correct?
I agree with that. And moving over the page, the rural zones is also a controlled activity status.
Okay, so that would indicate that the belief is that the management of reverse effects can be handled by way of conditions in the rural zone on subdivision, albeit that land use consent for a new residence within 500 metres of an established pig farm would require a consent.
Yes.
I might just be able to help here to join one of the docs as well. It's one of the standards for all subdivisions, standard 2, which is a requirement for each lot to have a building platform. And getting a standard 2 is that the building platform needs to comply with all relevant performance standards for the underlying zone. So in citing your building platform on your on the lot, you'd need to show that a 500 metre setback from an intensive farming activity. So if the building platform was within 500 metres of that at the time of subdivision, that would then trigger discretionary or discretionary depending on subdivision that is for that. So
that's standard 2.
That's standard 2.
But that's an example of how the plan chapters talk to each other and integrate.
So while on the initial assessment, it might be a controlled activity based on lot size and so on. But when you look at the building platform requirement and assess its compliance with the land use distances, that would then change it to a restricted discretionary and then you'd be able to consider a reverse sensitivity effect of, is that too close, and measures or reverse sensitivity effects be addressed.
Ms. Ritchie's not attending.
They have provided a summary statement.
Okay, that's useful. That may be the answer to our questions, and if so, if that could be incorporated into the right reply, that would be useful. But I guess that does talk to the relationship between subdivision and land use.
Okay. Next one, Rule 8.
Sub R8, subdivision of land containing a scheduled heritage building or item or of land within a scheduled heritage precinct. Mr. Raymond's evidence highlights that Heritage New Zealand Pohere Tonga's submission point S249.047 on sub R8 has not been addressed in the Section 42A report. This submission point was addressed in the Section 42A report on historic heritage, and it was recommended to be accepted. In summary, Heritage New Zealand Pohere Tonga's submission point supports a restricted discretionary activity status for the subdivision of sites containing a scheduled heritage item or within a heritage precinct. The submission point notes the matter of discretion in point 1 should refer to a historic heritage P11 and sub P3. Reporting officer agrees with the Heritage New Zealand Pohere Tonga's submission that seeks an amendment to include the policy numbering being HHP 11, subdivision of land containing a heritage building or item, sub P1, creation of and design of allotments, and sub P3, subdivision containing natural features or sites or items with significant values. Moving on to key issue 5, subdivision standard.
Sorry, just before you do, have those changes been made to HHP 11, sub P1 and sub P3? that what you're saying?
Yes, so Heritage New Zealand's submission point in the historic heritage chapter was accepted, and
Yes.
those changes were made within that chapter.
Okay. But okay, I can understand P11 being changed, and that, but what are the changes to sub P1, sub P3? That I,
They
I'm not seeing those changes in front of us here on the fact change version.
I have, sorry, let me check.
Jump in here. This is something Ms. Fellowford and I discussed, and I discussed with the other reporting officers. We've got an integration issue here between all the other hearings to date where there have been topic specific changes to the subdivision chapter. So a specific example are the minimum lot sizes. So this version of the chapter for today's hearing doesn't have any of the recommended amendments to minimum lot sizes that came through the zone chapters, for example. And so this is an example of that where the heritage provisions for subdivision were considered at hearing 5. This doesn't show the heritage amendments to the subdivision chapter. So we could do that for the reply statements.
Can we have that?
Have a version which is purely for the subdivision hearing today, and then a second version which incorporates all the amendments from all the other hearings to date as a complete package. We could leave that till the final hearing. We integrate all of the amendments into one chapter.
Could we have, instead of having 2 different documents, could we have all the changes today with the different colours and then do another colour for the integration of the chapters? And then we're only looking at one document as opposed to going backwards and forwards.
And we can add comments as to which that amendment relates to.
I think that would be quite useful to have it at this stage as opposed to waiting personally.
Yes, I'm just thinking in terms of what attachment to the decision report is used. I'm just a little bit mindful we don't want to lose any of these changes. So yeah, it's an administrative issue more than anything.
Doing a commented version so you know which amendment relates to what. Yeah,
what it doesn't just relate to heritage and subdivision, it relates to
all the previous.
Yes, and that comment I've just made applies to all chapters across the plan, particularly the stated definitions chapter.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Key issue 5, subdivision standards, paragraph 38. Mr. McGimpsey, Fire and Emergency New Zealand, seeks that the relief sought in Fire and Emergency New Zealand's original submission be adopted in relation to sub S10, firefighting water supply. I note that the anticipated land use for the proposed subdivision may not be known at the time resource consent is applied for. Therefore, the requirements for firefighting water supply may not be known. It is standard practice for council to include a condition of consent requiring firefighting water supply code of practice to be met. I recommended that sub S10 is amended from the recommendation in the section 42A report back to the proposed district plan as notified. The wording is set out in appendix 1 and 2.
Yes. Now that's a very good example. If you go to the S10, if the panel was to adopt this recommendation and the provisions are attached to the decision, there would be no colour in that document. It would all be black text because there's no change to the notified version. So
that's correct.
Yes. Okay. That's just a note to myself. Second question is, have you had any discussion with Ms. Robertson on this, given that she authored the response to the minutes that the panel issued in relation to firefighting standards?
Yes, I've read the minutes in relation to the firefighting standards.
Yeah. Okay. So when it's said at paragraph 39, second sentence, it's standard practice for council to include a condition of consent requiring the firefighting supply code to be met. You mean that's at subdivision stage?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. That was all.
Okay. All right, paragraph 40 number 5, recommended amendments.
Recommend amendments in response to pre-circulated expert evidence on the subdivision chapter. The recommended amendments in response to the pre-circulated expert evidence on the subdivision chapter are: insert new policy sub PX associated with managing the effects of subdivision on freshwater. Reflect track changes in proposed chapter sub 03 integrated future development. Amend wording in sub 03 to in relation to what is included in roading infrastructure. And D, amend sub S10 to the original notified wording in the proposed district plan.
Thank you.
Section 6, key matters in contention on the subdivision chapter. Based on the matters raised in the submissions and pre-circulated expert evidence, the following key matters remain in contention. Whether the definitions of water-sensitive urban design and hydraulic neutrality should be added. Whether sub 02 should be amended so that subdivision within the urban boundary connect to telecommunication and electricity networks alongside water, wastewater and stormwater networks, and that in subdivision in rural zones capable of connecting to a telecommunication network. This also includes consequential amendments needed to be made to sub P2. Linked to the point B above, whether an amendment to sub R2 is required to ensure that any connection made for new allotments to a telecommunication network be implemented in accordance with the network operator's requirements. D, whether the amendments to sub 03 with respect to the additional of public and transport network and services is supported as worded in Appendix 1 and 2. E, whether sub P1 clause A is unclear and places too much emphasis on the reinforcement of existing character and qualities. F, whether sub P1 expressly addresses reverse sensitivity for established primary production activities. G, whether controlled activity status for sub R2 and sub R4 is appropriate in relation to reverse sensitivity effects established on primary production activities, and whether matter of control is appropriately worded. H, the wording of sub S10 in relation to firefighting water supply.
Thank you. Any further questions? Else from anyone? I think we will break now for morning tea. How many? 10? 15 minutes. So if we come back at 11:05, then we will hear from Mr. Wesney on financial contributions, and then we will have our first submitter at 11:30. Adjourn the meeting.